in the heart of America, where jazz echoed through smoke-filled rooms and the law was just another player at the table. One man built an empire on fear, loyalty, and blood. His name was Nick Civella, and in Kansas City, that name meant power. This is the story of how a poor Italian kid from the North End became one of the most feared mob bosses west of the Mississippi. A man who controlled politicians, corrupted cops, and turned a Midwestern city into his own personal kingdom. But every empire has cracks, and every king eventually falls. The year was 1912. While America dreamed of progress and prosperity, the immigrants flooding into its cities knew a different reality, one of cramped tenements, brutal labor, and streets where survival meant being tougher than the guy next to you. In Kansas City's North End, where the Missouri River curved like a scar through the industrial heart of the city, a child was born who would one day rule those very streets with an iron fist. Nicholas Civella entered the world on March 19, 1912, in a neighborhood that smelled of coal smoke, rotting vegetables, and broken dreams. His parents, Rosario and Gaetana Civella, had come from Sicily, that ancient island where blood feuds ran deeper than any law, and where respect was earned through strength, not given through birthright. They carried with them the old ways, the codes of silence and loyalty that would later become the foundation of their son's criminal empire. The North End wasn't just poor, it was forgotten. A sprawling maze of wooden shacks and brick tenements where Italian, Irish, and Jewish immigrants competed for scraps. The streets were unpaved, turning to thick mud when it rained. Children ran barefoot between buildings, their laughter mixing with the sounds of arguments in a dozen different languages. There were no parks, no libraries, no escape from the grinding poverty that defined existence there. For young Nick, life was harsh from the beginning. His father worked back-breaking jobs, sometimes in the rail yards, sometimes in the meat-packing plants that lined the industrial corridor. The pay was miserable, the hours endless. His mother took in laundry, her hands perpetually red and raw from the scalding water and harsh soap. They lived in a 3-room apartment that housed not just the immediate family, but often cousins, newly arrived relatives, anyone from the old country who needed a place to land. But poverty wasn't the only education Nick received in those formative years. The North End operated under its own laws, invisible to outsiders but crystal clear to those who lived there. There were men in the neighborhood who didn't work in the factories or the rail yards. Men who dressed better, walked with confidence, and commanded respect with just a look. They ran the gambling operations, the loan sharking, the protection rackets. They were the neighborhood's real power structure, and young Nick Civella watched them with fascination. By the time he was 10, Nick was already running errands for these men. Nothing serious at first, delivering messages, keeping watch on street corners, learning who could be trusted and who couldn't. In return, he got coins that meant his family ate a little better, and more importantly, he got an education in how power really worked. The streets taught him lessons no school could. He learned that fear and respect were two sides of the same coin. That loyalty was currency more valuable than cash. That violence, applied correctly, was just another form of communication. These weren't abstract concepts to debate. They were survival skills, as necessary as knowing how to read or write. Nick's formal education was minimal. Like most immigrant kids in the North End, School was something you attended when there wasn't work to be done or money to be earned. By age 12, he dropped out entirely. Why waste time learning about history and mathematics when the real lessons were being taught on the streets? Why study books when you could study men, their weaknesses, their desires, their breaking points? His teenage years coincided with a period of transformation in Kansas City. The city was growing rapidly, fueled by its position as a railroad hub and cattle center. With growth came opportunity, and with opportunity came those willing to exploit it through any means necessary. The Pendergast machine was consolidating its control over the city's politics, creating a system where gambling, prostitution, and illegal alcohol sales were not just tolerated but organized and taxed. Young Nick was paying attention to all of it. He watched how Tom Pendergast turned corruption into an art form, how the right connections could make you untouchable, how politicians and policemen could be bought just like any other commodity. These were lessons that would shape his entire approach to power in the years to come. But the North End wasn't just about crime and corruption. It was also about family, about the bonds that held the immigrant community together. Nick's extended family network was vast: cousins, uncles, childhood friends who would later become his most trusted associates. In the Sicilian tradition, family loyalty was absolute. You could lie to the police, to the government, to anyone outside the circle, but within the family, your word was sacred. This concept of famiglia would become central to how Nick Civella operated. The organization he would eventually build wasn't just a criminal enterprise. It was a family business, bound by blood and reinforced by the old codes brought over from Sicily. Omerta, the code of silence. A man who talked to the police wasn't just a criminal. He was a traitor to his blood, deserving only death. As Nick moved through his teenage years, his reputation in the North End began to grow. He wasn't the biggest or the strongest, but he had something more valuable: a cold intelligence that let him see angles others missed, and an absolute willingness to do whatever was necessary. By 16, he was running his own small crew, dealing in stolen goods, running dice games, and learning the subtle art of intimidation. But Nick understood something crucial that many young criminals didn't. Violence without purpose was just thuggery. True power came from being smart enough to know when to hit someone and when to buy them. He studied the successful criminals in Kansas City's underworld, learning from both their successes and their failures. He saw men who were feared but not respected, and men who were respected but not feared, and he understood that to truly rule, you needed both. The early 1920s brought prohibition, and with it, opportunities beyond anything the small-time criminals of the North End had ever imagined. Suddenly, alcohol, which had always been legal and readily available, became contraband. And contraband meant profit. Enormous, staggering profit for anyone organized enough and ruthless enough to seize it. Nick Civella was 19 years old when Prohibition began, and he recognized it immediately for what it was: a gift from the government to organized crime. Every speakeasy that opened, every truck hauling bootleg whiskey across state lines, every politician who needed to wet his whistle, it all meant money. More money than the North End had ever seen. But getting a piece of that money meant navigating a dangerous new landscape. The old neighborhood bosses were being challenged by younger, hungrier men. Rival gangs were carving up territories, and the battles were often settled with Thompson submachine guns rather than negotiation. Kansas City was transforming from a relatively peaceful Midwestern city into a war zone where dozens of murders went unsolved every year. Nick positioned himself carefully during these years. He wasn't ready to challenge the established powers yet, but he was too ambitious to remain a mere foot soldier. Instead, he became valuable, the kind of operator who could solve problems, make connections, and most importantly, be trusted with serious responsibilities. He developed relationships with the Italians, who controlled much of the bootlegging, but also with the Irish gangs and Jewish mobsters who dominated other rackets. This was crucial. While many gangsters saw the world in terms of ethnic boundaries, Nick understood that money had no nationality. He could work with anyone who was willing to be reasonable, and he could kill anyone who wasn't, regardless of where they came from. His first major test came in 1924, when a dispute over gambling territory in the North End threatened to explode into open warfare. Two factions were preparing for a bloodbath that would have drawn unwanted police attention and destroyed the delicate arrangements that allowed the rackets to operate. Nick, still only in his early 20s, brokered a peace that satisfied both sides. It wasn't about fairness, it was about showing each faction that cooperation meant more profit than conflict. Asterisk. The settlement earned him respect from men twice his age. Here was someone who could think strategically, who understood that the real enemy wasn't the other gangs but anything that threatened the money. The police could be managed. Politicians could be bought. But gang wars were chaos, and chaos was bad for business. By the mid-1920s, Nick Civella was no longer just another North End hustler. He was becoming a power in his own right, a man whose opinion mattered, whose protection was valuable, whose enmity was dangerous. He was building something that would last far beyond the Prohibition era, a criminal organization that would dominate Kansas City for decades. Asterisk. But he was also making enemies. There were men who resented his rise, who saw him as too ambitious, too ruthless, too willing to break the old codes when it suited him. There were police detectives who had him marked as someone to watch. There were rival gangsters who would have killed him in a moment if they thought they could get away with it. Nick understood all of this. He understood that in the world he'd chosen, every day was a test. Show weakness once and you were finished. Make one major mistake and you were dead. The streets of the North End that had raised him were unforgiving, and they had taught him to be equally unforgiving in return. As the 1920s roared forward, as Kansas City transformed into a wide-open city where almost anything was available for the right price, Nick Civella was positioning himself for something greater than his childhood neighbors could have imagined. The poor Italian kid from the tenements was learning to think like a businessman, to organize like a general, to kill like an assassin. He was learning to be a mob boss, and Kansas City, whether it knew it or not, was about to belong to him. Asterisk. Every empire begins with a single act of audacity, a moment when a man looks at the world as it is and decides to remake it in his own image. For Nick Civella, that moment came in the violent crucible of the late 1920s and early 1930s, when Kansas City's underworld was up for grabs and only the strongest, smartest, and most ruthless would survive. This is the story of his ascent, a climb built on loyalty, intelligence, and the willingness to do what others wouldn't. The Kansas City that Nick Civella sought to conquer in the late 1920s was unlike any other American city. Under the corrupt but efficient rule of Tom Pendergast's political machine, Kansas City had become a criminal paradise. While other cities made at least token efforts to enforce prohibition and gambling laws, Kansas City operated under a different code entirely. Here, vice wasn't just tolerated, it was franchised, organized, and taxed like any legitimate business. Pendergast's system was elegant in its corruption. The machine controlled the police department, the courts, and City Hall. In exchange for campaign contributions and a percentage of the profits, criminal operations were allowed to function openly. Speakeasies operated with bright neon signs. Gambling houses took out advertisements in newspapers. Prostitution flourished in designated districts. It was corruption as civic policy, and it created an environment where organized crime could thrive like nowhere else in America. But this paradise had a price. Competition was fierce, and the stakes were life and death. By the late 1920s, Kansas City's underworld was divided among several powerful factions. The Irish gangs, remnants of the old neighborhood crews, still controlled significant territory. Jewish mobsters like Solly Wiseman ran sophisticated gambling and loan sharking operations. And the Italians, split into various family groups, were fighting among themselves for dominance. Nick Civella, now in his late 20s, found himself in a pivotal position. He wasn't yet a boss, but he was far more than a simple soldier. He had become a caporegime, a captain, controlling his own crew and reporting to the older bosses who still technically ran the Italian factions. But Nick was impatient. He looked at the men above him and saw their weaknesses. They were old school, stuck in the ways they'd learned in Sicily. Unable to adapt to American realities, Nick understood something his predecessors didn't. Organized crime in America couldn't operate like it did in the old country. Here, you needed to work across ethnic lines. You needed to understand modern business practices. You needed to corrupt the system rather than fight against it. Most importantly, you needed to think bigger than neighborhood rackets and street level. Hustle's dot, his opportunity came during the chaos of 1929. In the early 1930s, the stock market crash that devastated. Legitimate businesses barely touched the underworld. People still drank, gambled, and sought entertainment regardless of economic conditions. If anything, the Depression made Kansas City's vice industry even more profitable as desperate people sought escape from their troubles and desperate men were willing to work for the mob. But the Depression also intensified competition. With legitimate opportunities drying up, more men turned to crime, and the struggle for control became even more violent. Kansas City's streets ran with blood as rival factions fought over territory, tribute, and respect. During this period, Nick Civella would orchestrate the moves that would eventually make him boss of Kansas City's Italian mob. His first major play was forming an alliance with the Corallo family, who controlled much of the Italian criminal activity in the city. Joseph "Joe Scarface" Corallo was an old-school boss, powerful but set in his ways. Nick positioned himself as Corallo's most capable lieutenant, taking on the difficult jobs, solving the problems that required intelligence as well as muscle. He became indispensable, but Nick was also building his own power base, carefully recruiting men who were loyal to him personally rather than to the older bosses. He understood the importance of having soldiers who would follow his orders without question, who feared his retribution more than anyone else's. He was methodical about this, choosing men not just for their toughness, but for their reliability and discretion. One of his most important early recruits was his younger brother, Carl "Corky" Civella. In the Sicilian tradition, blood loyalty was absolute, and having his brother in the organization gave Nick someone he could trust completely. Corky would become his underboss, his most trusted advisor, and his enforcer for the most sensitive operations. Nick also cultivated relationships outside the Italian mob. He developed connections with Jewish mobsters, recognizing that they controlled crucial gambling operations and had connections to major organized crime figures in other cities. He worked with the Irish when necessary, despite the historical tensions between Irish and Italian gangs. And most crucially, he built relationships with Tom Pendergast's political machine. This was perhaps Nick's greatest insight. The real power in Kansas City wasn't in the streets, it was in City Hall. Pendergast controlled everything that mattered: the police, the courts, the licensing boards, the construction contracts. A gangster with Pendergast's protection was untouchable. A gangster without it was constantly looking over his shoulder. Nick made himself valuable to the machine. He delivered Italian votes in the North End during elections. He made generous campaign contributions. He ensured that the machine's gambling operations ran smoothly and that tribute was paid on time. In return, he received something priceless: protection from prosecution and advance warning of any police raids or investigations. The early 1930s also saw Nick's first major confrontations with rivals who didn't understand the new order he was creating. There were those who saw him as too young, too ambitious, too willing to break with tradition. These men had to be dealt with, not always through violence, though Nick was never squeamish about that necessity, but through the more subtle arts of undermining their operations, stealing their soldiers, and isolating them within the underworld. One such rival was an older Italian gangster named Michael "Iron Mike" Rossini, who controlled gambling operations in the River Market district. Rossini represented the old way of doing things: territorial, violent, and ultimately short-sighted. He refused to cooperate with the larger organization Nick was building. Seeing it as a threat to his independence, Nick's response was calculated and brutal. First, he strangled Rossini's businesses by pressuring suppliers and corrupting the cops who had been protecting him. Then he recruited several of Rossini's best soldiers, offering them better positions in his growing organization. Finally, when Rossini was isolated and weakened, Nick arranged a sit-down to negotiate a peaceful resolution. What happened at that meeting remains a subject of speculation. Officially, nothing. Rossini agreed to terms that essentially made him subordinate to Nick's organization. Unofficially, those who were there reported that Nick's message was clear: cooperate and prosper, or resist and die. There was no third option. Rossini, reading the situation correctly, chose cooperation. He would remain a captain in the organization. But Nick had established dominance. This pattern repeated itself throughout the early 1930s. Nick was building a machine, consolidating the fractured Italian criminal operations in Kansas City under a single command structure. It wasn't technically a traditional mafia family. Kansas City was too far from the eastern centers of Italian-American organized crime for that. But it functioned the same way: a hierarchy of bosses, captains, and soldiers, all bound by oaths of loyalty and enforced by the threat of death for betrayal. By 1934, Nick Civella effectively controlled organized crime in Kansas City's Italian community. Joe Corallo was still nominally the boss, but everyone in the underworld knew where the real power lay. Nick was the strategist, the organizer, the man who made things happen. Corallo was content to collect his tribute and let Nick handle the day-to-day operations. But Nick's ambitions extended far beyond Kansas City. He began traveling to other cities, Chicago, New York, Detroit, meeting with major organized crime figures and establishing relationships that would prove crucial in later years. He understood that organized crime was becoming truly national in scope, and that Kansas City needed to be part of that larger network. His most important connection was with the Chicago outfit, the powerful organized crime syndicate that controlled much of the Midwest. Chicago saw Kansas City as important real estate, a strategic location for moving goods, and a lucrative market for gambling and other rackets. Nick positioned himself as Chicago's man in Kansas City, promising cooperation and tribute in exchange for backing and protection. This relationship with Chicago would define much of Nick's career. It gave him powerful allies who could help him deal with rivals and threats. But it also meant he was never entirely his own boss. He would always have to answer to Chicago, always have to consider their interests in his decisions. It was a deal with the devil that brought enormous benefits, but also dangerous obligations that the mid-1930s brought new challenges and opportunities. Prohibition ended in 1933, eliminating the enormously profitable bootlegging trade. Many gangsters who had built empires on illegal alcohol found themselves struggling to adapt. But Nick had anticipated this. He had been diversifying his operations for years, investing heavily in gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and legitimate businesses that could be used to launder criminal proceeds. He also recognized that the end of prohibition meant new forms of vice would become profitable. He invested in narcotics distribution, though he kept this at arm's length, understanding the heat that drug dealing brought from law enforcement. He expanded into prostitution, taking over several brothels and call girl operations. He developed protection rackets in the nightclub district, where every establishment that wanted to stay in business paid Nick for the privilege. But perhaps his most lucrative operation was illegal gambling. Kansas City in the 1930s was a gambler's paradise. Dice games, card rooms, horse betting, and eventually sports betting generated millions of dollars in annual revenue. Nick controlled much of this action, either directly or through tribute from independent operators. He developed sophisticated systems for managing the money, hiding the profits, and ensuring that the right people got paid off. His gambling empire extended beyond Kansas City proper. He developed relationships with operators in smaller Missouri towns, in Kansas, even reaching into Iowa and Oklahoma. These rural operations were less visible than the city action, but enormously profitable. And they helped spread Nick's influence far beyond his home base. The late 1930s also saw Nick beginning to invest in seemingly legitimate businesses, restaurants, vending machine companies, construction firms. These served multiple purposes. They provided legitimate income that could be reported on tax returns. They laundered money from illegal operations, and they gave him another avenue for control over the Kansas City economy. One of his most successful fronts was the Villa Capri restaurant, which became a Kansas City institution. On the surface, it was simply a fine Italian restaurant frequented by businessmen, politicians, and celebrities. Below the surface, It was the headquarters of Nick's criminal empire, the place where deals were made. Disputes were settled, and tribute was paid. By 1939, as America stood on the brink of World War II, Nick Civella had achieved something remarkable. At age 27, he was effectively running Kansas City's Italian organized crime operations. He controlled gambling, loan sharking, and vice throughout the metropolitan area. He had connections to major crime families in other cities. He had corrupted significant portions of the Kansas City Police Department and maintained good relationships with Pendergast's political machine. But he had also made enemies. There were those in the underworld who resented his power and waited for an opportunity to strike. There were honest cops and federal agents who recognized him as a major criminal and were building cases against him. And there were rival organizations, Irish, Jewish, and independent operators who chafed under his growing dominance. Nick understood all of this. He knew that power in the underworld was never secure, that today's ally could be tomorrow's enemy, that the only way to survive was through constant vigilance and the willingness to strike first when threatened. The rise had been brutal, requiring compromises, betrayals, and violence that would haunt lesser men. But Nick Civella wasn't a lesser man. He was a mob boss, a criminal emperor in the making. And he was just getting started. The real empire and the real infamy was yet to come. Asterisk. There are moments in history when criminal and legitimate power become so intertwined that they're impossible to separate. When a gangster's influence reaches into every corner of a city's life. For Nick Civella, the 1940s through the 1960s represented this apex of power. He didn't just run criminal operations. He shaped Kansas City itself, deciding who succeeded and who failed, who lived and who died. This was his empire at its peak, magnificent, terrible, and ultimately unsustainable. The 1940s dawned with Nick Civella in an increasingly powerful position. But the decade would test him in ways he hadn't anticipated. America's entry into World War II in 1941 transformed the country, and the underworld was no exception. Many young criminals were drafted or enlisted, disrupting crews and operations. Federal attention shifted toward the war effort, giving organized crime breathing room. And the wartime economy, with its rationing and shortages, created black market opportunities that dwarfed anything from the Prohibition era. Nick adapted brilliantly. While other mobsters struggled with the wartime disruptions, he saw opportunity. Rationed goods, gasoline, rubber, meat, sugar became contraband. As valuable as liquor had been in the 1920s, Nick developed sophisticated systems for obtaining ration stamps through theft and corruption, for diverting supplies from military shipments, for operating black market distribution networks. His genius was in organization. While small-time criminals sold individual items for quick profits, Nick built an infrastructure that could move large quantities efficiently. He corrupted warehouse managers, bribed transportation officials, and developed relationships with business owners who desperately needed supplies that couldn't be obtained legally. The profits were staggering, and they came with relatively little legal risk. As law enforcement was focused on more serious wartime threats, but Nick's most significant move during the war years was consolidating his control over the Kansas City mob. Joe Corallo, the nominal boss, was aging and increasingly disconnected from day-to-day operations. In 1943, Corallo officially stepped aside, making Nick Civella the undisputed boss of Kansas City's Italian organized crime family. At age 31, Nick had achieved his ultimate ambition. His first acts as boss revealed his strategic thinking. Rather than purging potential rivals, he incorporated them into his organization, giving them positions of respect and profit while making clear that ultimate authority rested with him. He established a clear hierarchy modeled on the traditional Mafia structure, himself as boss, his brother Corky as underboss, and several trusted capos controlling different operations and territories. Nick also formalized his relationship with the Chicago outfit. Kansas City would operate semi-autonomously, but ultimately answer to Chicago in matters of major importance. In return, Chicago provided muscle when needed and helped negotiate disputes with other crime families. It was a subordinate position, but Nick understood that having powerful allies was worth the cost to his pride. The post-war years brought unprecedented prosperity to both America and its underworld. Kansas City, positioned at the crossroads of the nation, boomed as a transportation and entertainment hub. And Nick Civella was positioned to exploit every aspect of that growth. His gambling empire expanded dramatically during the late 1940s and 1950s. He controlled dozens of illegal casinos operating throughout the metropolitan area, sophisticated operations that rivaled Las Vegas in their professionalism. These weren't backroom dice games. They were full-scale casinos with roulette wheels, card tables, and slot machines, staffed by trained dealers and protected by corrupt police who received generous payoffs. But Nick's greatest gambling coup came from an unexpected source: Las Vegas, in the late 1940s and early 1950s. As Las Vegas transformed from a desert outpost into a gambling mecca, organized crime families from around the country invested in the new casinos. Nick, representing Kansas City's interests and backed by Chicago, secured hidden ownership stakes in several major properties. The genius of the Las Vegas operation was the skim, the practice of taking cash from casino counting rooms before it was officially recorded, thus avoiding taxes and hiding the mob's ownership. Nick helped perfect this system, and the money flowing back to Kansas City from Las Vegas was enormous. Estimates suggest millions of dollars annually, all of it tax-free and untraceable. This Las Vegas connection also elevated Nick's status within the national organized crime network. He attended meetings with bosses from New York, Chicago, Detroit, and other major cities. He was consulted on major decisions affecting the underworld nationwide. The poor kid from Kansas City's North End had become a player on the national stage. But Nick's empire extended far beyond gambling. His loan sharking operations provided high-interest loans to desperate borrowers, business owners, gamblers, addicts who couldn't get legitimate credit. The interest rates were usurious, often 100% or more annually, and failure to pay resulted in violence or forced takeover of the borrower's assets. It was predatory and brutal, but enormously profitable. His labor racketeering gave him control over several union locals, particularly in the Teamsters. This control meant he could deliver labor peace or provoke strikes depending on what served his interests. Contractors paid him for the privilege of avoiding labor problems. Companies paid him to ensure their competitors faced union difficulties. It was extortion dressed up as labor relations, and it generated steady income while giving Nick influence over legitimate businesses. The 1950s also saw Nick expanding into legitimate businesses more aggressively. He owned restaurants, vending machine companies, laundries, and construction firms. Some of these were profitable in their own right. Others existed primarily to launder money or provide legitimate-appearing income. But all of them gave him deeper penetration into Kansas City's economy and society. His influence extended into Kansas City's political structure as well. While the Pendergast machine had collapsed in the early 1940s due to federal prosecution, Nick had adapted by spreading his political influence more broadly. He didn't control City Hall the way Pendergast had, but he had relationships with politicians from both parties, ensuring that no administration would move against him too aggressively. He corrupted police at every level. Beat cops received cash for looking the other way. Detectives received larger payoffs for sabotaging investigations, and commanders received the largest payments for protecting his operations from serious scrutiny. Not every cop was corrupt, but enough were to make law enforcement largely ineffective against Nick's organization. The justice system received similar treatment. Judges received campaign contributions and other benefits. Prosecutors found that cases against Nick's organization mysteriously fell apart due to missing evidence or uncooperative witnesses. Defense attorneys who effectively represented his men received future referrals and generous payments. It was corruptionist system, making prosecution nearly impossible. But empire building came with costs and enemies. Throughout the 1950s, Nick faced challenges from multiple directions. There were rival criminals who resented his dominance and sought to carve out their own territories. There were FBI agents, particularly after J. Edgar Hoover finally acknowledged the existence of organized crime in the late 1950s, who began building serious cases against mob figures nationwide. And there was violence, the unavoidable currency of the underworld. Nick ordered murders when necessary, always carefully insulated from the actual killing. Informants were eliminated. Rivals who couldn't be bought or intimidated were killed. Associates who showed weakness or disloyalty disappeared. The exact number of murders attributable to Nick's organization will never be known, but it was certainly dozens, possibly more. One of the most notorious incidents occurred in 1953, when a rival operator named James Buster Murphy tried to move in on Nick's gambling territory in the northeast section of Kansas City. Murphy was connected to out-of-state interests and thought he had enough backing to challenge Nick's monopoly. He was wrong. Nick's response was methodical and terrifying. First, Murphy's operations were hit by police raids, not because the cops suddenly cared about illegal gambling, but because Nick had paid them to target his competitor. Then Murphy's associates began experiencing accidents and arrests. Finally, Murphy himself was found shot to death in his car outside a downtown hotel. The message was clear. Challenge Nick Civella and die. No one was ever prosecuted for Murphy's murder. Witnesses suddenly couldn't remember what they'd seen. Physical evidence disappeared. The investigation quietly died, another unsolved gangland killing in a city that had seen dozens. It was a demonstration of Nick's power, not just his willingness to kill, but his ability to get away with it. The late 1950s and early 1960s represented the absolute peak of Nick's power. His organization was generating millions annually from gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and Las Vegas skimming. He controlled significant portions of Kansas City's economy. He lived in a mansion in an exclusive neighborhood, drove luxury cars, and was treated with respect by legitimate businessmen and politicians who publicly would have denied even knowing him. He also achieved a certain celebrity status. While careful to avoid the spotlight in ways that might bring federal attention, Nick was known throughout Kansas City. Newspaper articles about organized crime mentioned him. He was pointed out at restaurants and nightclubs. There was a certain perverse respect for him. Here was a man who had risen from nothing to rule a city, who had outsmarted the law and built an empire. His personal life during these years was complex. He married and had children, presenting an image of family respectability, even as he ordered murders and ran criminal operations. His home life was, by some accounts, quite conventional. Family dinners, children's school events, church attendance. It was compartmentalization at its finest, the ability to be a loving father and husband while simultaneously being a ruthless mob boss. But there were costs to this double life that would become apparent later. The stress of constantly maintaining multiple identities, of always being on guard, of never knowing whom to trust completely. The paranoia that came with knowing that everyone around him, from his closest associates to the politicians he corrupted, might betray him if the price was right or the pressure too great. By the mid-1960s, Nick Civella stood at the absolute zenith of his power. He was approximately 53 years old, wealthy beyond his childhood dreams, and more powerful than any criminal Kansas City had ever known. He had achieved everything he'd set out to achieve when he was a young hustler in the North End. But the American underworld was changing. The FBI, armed with new laws and technologies, was targeting organized crime figures with unprecedented aggressiveness. The Code of Omerta was weakening as more criminals chose cooperation over prison. And most ominously, the vast profits that had made Kansas City so valuable were attracting attention from rival crime families who wanted a bigger share. The empire Nick had built over 3 decades was about to face its greatest challenges. The law was closing in. His organization was about to be infiltrated by informants. And time itself, the one enemy no amount of corruption or violence could defeat, was running out. The golden age was ending. The fall was about to begin. Asterisk. Every empire contains the seeds of its own destruction. For Nick Civella, those seeds had been planted during his rise to power, in the enemies he'd made, the laws he'd broken, the loyalty he demanded but couldn't always receive. By the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s, the empire he'd spent decades building would begin to crumble, brick by brick, betrayal by betrayal, until the king of Kansas City found himself facing the one thing he'd always managed to avoid: accountability. The first cracks in Nick Civella's empire appeared not from law enforcement, but from within the underworld itself. The late 1960s saw increasing tensions between crime families across the country, driven by competition for shrinking profits and younger gangsters who didn't share the old codes of respect and hierarchy. Kansas City, with its valuable Las Vegas connections and lucrative gambling operations, became a target. In 1969, a dispute arose with the Chicago outfit over the distribution of skimmed money from Las Vegas casinos. Chicago, which had always viewed Kansas City as its satellite, wanted a larger percentage. Nick, proud and protective of his organization's interests, pushed back. It was a dangerous position. Chicago had the power to make life very difficult for Kansas City. But Nick couldn't afford to appear weak to his own men. The dispute was eventually resolved through sit-downs with organized crime leaders from other cities mediating. Nick had to concede some ground, accepting a slightly smaller share of the skim in exchange for continued Chicago backing. But the episode revealed something crucial. Nick's position wasn't as secure as it had seemed. The alliances that had protected him could dissolve if powerful interests decided he was more trouble than he was worth. But the real threat came from a different direction: the federal government. In 1970, Congress passed the Racketeer, Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO. This revolutionary law allowed prosecutors to charge entire criminal organizations and to use evidence of multiple crimes committed over time to prove a pattern of racketeering. It was designed specifically to take down mob bosses who insulated themselves from direct involvement in crimes. Nick initially underestimated RICO's significance. He'd spent decades avoiding prosecution by staying several steps removed from actual criminal acts, by ensuring there were always intermediaries between him and the crimes his organization committed. But RICO changed the rules. Now, prosecutors could build cases based on Nick's position as boss and the pattern of criminal activity his organization engaged in. The FBI in Kansas City, led by increasingly aggressive agents who'd been studying Nick's organization for years, began building a RICO case. They used wiretaps, which had been made easier by new federal laws. They developed informants within the organization. They followed the money through increasingly sophisticated financial investigations. They were patient, methodical, and determined. But Nick was also facing problems from an unexpected source: his own health. In the early 1970s, he was diagnosed with cancer. The disease, which would plague him for the rest of his life, weakened him physically and created a perception of vulnerability. In the underworld, weakness invites challenges, and there were those within his own organization who began to wonder if it might be time for new leadership. His brother Corky, who had always been his most loyal supporter, began taking on more day-to-day operations. But Corky didn't have Nick's strategic mind or his ability to navigate the complex political relationships that kept the organization protected. Decisions that Nick would have handled deftly became sources of internal tension. Associates who had feared and respected Nick didn't necessarily feel the same way about Corky. In 1973, Nick faced his first serious federal prosecution. He was indicted on charges related to interstate gambling operations. It wasn't the most serious case. The government was essentially testing its approach, seeing how strong its evidence was and whether witnesses would cooperate. But it was a warning shot. The feds were coming, and they weren't going to stop. Nick's lawyers managed to get him acquitted on technical grounds. Witnesses recanted. Evidence was challenged. The jury couldn't reach a verdict on some charges and acquitted on others. Nick walked out of the courthouse a free man, seeming to have beaten the government once again. But prosecutors had learned valuable lessons about what would work in future cases. The mid-1970s brought the beginning of the end. Las Vegas. Federal authorities had been investigating mob involvement in Las Vegas casinos for years, and in 1976 they scored a major breakthrough. An insider at one of the casinos Nick's organization had interests in began cooperating with the FBI, providing detailed information about the skimming operation. The Las Vegas money had been the jewel in Nick's crown, generating millions in untaxed income annually. Now that source of income was under intense scrutiny. Worse, the investigation was revealing the connections between Kansas City, Chicago, and other crime families, building a picture of a nationwide criminal conspiracy that could be prosecuted under RICO. Nick tried to adapt. He distanced himself from the Las Vegas operations, at least on paper. He attempted to shut down the most visible elements of the scheme. But it was too late. The government had years of evidence, hundreds of hours of wiretapped conversations, and cooperating witnesses who could testify about how the system worked out in 1978. Nick and several associates were indicted on federal charges related to the Las Vegas skimming operation. This wasn't a minor case that could be beaten on technicalities. This was a major RICO prosecution with overwhelming evidence. Nick faced the very real possibility of spending the rest of his life in federal prison. The trial, which began in 1979, was a sensation. For decades, Nick had operated in the shadows, his power acknowledged but never fully exposed. Now, in federal court, prosecutors laid out in detail how his organization worked. The structure, the corruption, the violence, the millions in illegal profits. Witnesses testified about murders, bribery, and extortion. Wiretaps played in court captured. Nick and his associates discussing criminal activities. Nick's defense was that he was merely a businessman, that any illegal activities were committed by associates without his knowledge or approval. But the evidence was too strong. The jury saw through the carefully constructed facade. In December 1979, Nick Civella was convicted on multiple federal charges. The sentencing came in early, 1,980, 4 years in federal prison. For a man in his late 60s, battling cancer, it was potentially a life sentence. But even more devastating than the prison time was what the conviction represented. The invincible mob boss of Kansas City had been defeated by the very system. He'd spent decades corrupting. Prison was a humiliation Nick had never experienced. He was housed in a federal facility with younger criminals who sometimes didn't even know who he was. The respect he'd commanded in Kansas City meant nothing behind federal walls. He was just another inmate, subject to the rules and schedules dictated by guards, many of whom took particular pleasure in enforcing every regulation on the once powerful mob boss. His health deteriorated in prison. The cancer that had been manageable with proper treatment became more aggressive. He lost weight, lost energy, lost the vitality that had always been part of his presence. Visitors from Kansas City came less frequently. Some of his associates, sensing that his power was broken, began making their own arrangements, cutting deals with prosecutors or with rival factions. The empire was unraveling. With Nick in prison, leadership fell to Corky and other lieutenants who didn't have the same authority or respect. The organization began fragmenting. Some crews started operating independently. Others were picked off by federal prosecutions as the FBI. Emboldened by its success against Nick, continued building cases. The Las Vegas scheme, which had generated so much income for so long, was completely shut down. Federal authorities had casino management replaced, instituted new accounting procedures, and maintained constant surveillance. The golden goose was dead, and with it went millions in annual revenue. Even more devastating was the collapse of protection. With Nick's conviction, politicians and police who had been on his payroll began distancing themselves. New police leadership, committed to actually enforcing the law, began aggressive campaigns against remaining mob operations. Without protection, gambling establishments were raided and shut down. Loan sharking operations were prosecuted. The machinery of corruption that had protected the organization for decades stopped working. Informants multiplied. Men who had been Nick's associates for years saw the organization falling apart and decided to save themselves. They went to the FBI, They testified before grand juries. They provided evidence that led to more indictments. The Code of Omerta, always more ideal than reality, shattered completely under the pressure of long federal prison sentences. In 1983, after serving 3 years, Nick was released from federal prison. He was 71 years old, physically broken by cancer and imprisonment, and he returned to a Kansas City that had changed dramatically in his absence. The organization he'd built was a shadow of its former self. Many of his old associates were dead, in prison, or had turned informant. The rackets that had generated millions were shut down or operated by new crews he didn't control. The city itself seemed different. Kansas City in the early 1980s was trying to reinvent itself as a modern, corporate-friendly city. The old downtown entertainment districts where vice had flourished were being redeveloped. The political culture had changed. Corruption still existed, but the kind of open alliance between criminals and politicians that Nick had exploited was no longer possible. Nick himself was a changed man. The cancer was terminal. Doctors gave him months, maybe a year or two. The physical decline was obvious. The once powerful boss now walked slowly, tired easily, and looked frail. But perhaps more significant was the psychological impact. He'd spent his entire adult life as a man of power, feared and respected. Now he was just an old criminal, defeated and dying. His last months were spent largely at home, rarely venturing out. Old associates who'd once sought his advice and approval now went about their business without consulting him. The Villa Capri restaurant, which had been his headquarters, was under new management and no longer served as a mob meeting place. His phone, which had once rung constantly with people seeking his blessing or reporting to him, was mostly silent. There's a particular cruelty in watching a powerful man become powerless. Nick Civella, who had ruled Kansas City for 4 decades, who had ordered murders and corrupted institutions, who had lived like a king, was ending his life as just another dying old man. The empire he'd built with such ruthlessness and intelligence had crumbled, largely in his own lifetime, allowing him to see everything he'd achieved turn to dust. Asterisk, in March 1983, just months after his release from prison, Nick Civella suffered a massive heart attack. He was rushed to the hospital, but there was little that could be done. On March 12, 1983, Nick Civella died at age 71. The official cause was heart failure, though his doctors said the cancer would have killed him within months regardless. His funeral was a study in contrasts. On one hand, it was well attended by family, old associates, and members of Kansas City's Italian community who remembered the North End kid who'd made it big. On the other hand, it was nothing like the elaborate gangland funerals of earlier eras. There were no massive floral arrangements from crime families across the country. No delegations from New York or Chicago. Just a modest service for a man whose time had passed. The newspapers covered his death, but the stories were brief. Some mentioned his criminal career, others focused on his family and community connections. But there was a sense that Nick Civella was already becoming a relic, a figure from Kansas City's past, rather than someone who mattered in its present. In the months after Nick's death, federal prosecutors continued dismantling what remained of his organization. More associates were indicted. More operations were shut down. By the mid-1980s, the Kansas City mob, as Nick had built it, essentially ceased to exist as a significant force in the city's life. It was a complete fall. from the absolute peak of power in the 1960s to death while the organization crumbled around him. Nick Civella had experienced one of the steepest descents in organized crime history, not just imprisoned, but living to see his empire destroyed before his death. The king of Kansas City died knowing his kingdom was already lost. Asterisk, every life, no matter how lived, teaches lessons to those willing to learn them. Nick Civella's story, his rise from poverty to power, his decades of criminal dominance, and his ultimate fall offers a stark examination of power, corruption, loyalty, and the American dream's dark reflection. In his death, Kansas City began to reckon with what his reign had meant, what it had cost, and what remains of his legacy decades later. In the immediate aftermath of Nick Civella's death in 1983, Kansas City found itself in a strange position. For 40 years, organized crime had been a significant force in the city's life, not always visible, but always present, shaping politics, business, and culture in ways both obvious and subtle. Now, with the organization Nick built largely dismantled and its boss dead, the city had to confront what his reign had actually meant. The economic legacy was perhaps the most tangible. Millions of dollars had flowed through Nick's organization over the decades, money that never paid taxes, never contributed to legitimate economic growth, and ultimately enriched a small criminal elite at the expense of everyone else. The gambling operations, while providing entertainment to some, had bankrupted countless families. The loan sharking had destroyed small businesses. The labor racketeering had distorted competition and driven up costs. But there was also an argument, made by some historians and journalists who studied the period, that Nick's reign had brought a certain order to Kansas City's underworld. Before his consolidation of power, the city had experienced significant gang violence. Under his rule, while violence certainly occurred, it was controlled and targeted rather than random. Some argued this actually made Kansas City safer than it might have been with multiple competing criminal factions. This is, of course, a deeply cynical perspective. Celebrating a gangster for making crime more efficient is hardly a positive legacy. But it reflects the complicated reality of how organized crime operated in American cities during the mid-20th century. Nick didn't create criminality in Kansas City. He organized and professionalized it. The political legacy is harder to assess, but perhaps more significant. Nick's corruption of Kansas City's political and law enforcement systems had effects that lasted long after his death. The relationships he built, the precedents he set, the culture of corruption he fostered, these things didn't disappear overnight. Even today, Kansas City occasionally faces corruption scandals that echo the patterns Nick established. Politicians taking payoffs, cops looking the other way, the blurred line between legitimate and criminal enterprise. Perhaps more damaging was the cynicism his reign engendered. For generations of Kansas City residents, the lesson of Nick Civella's career was that the system was corrupt, that power and money could buy anything, that the law applied differently to connected people than to regular citizens. This kind of civic disillusionment has effects that ripple far beyond organized crime, undermining trust in institutions and democratic participation. Within the Italian-American community, Nick's legacy is particularly complex. On one hand, he was a source of pride for some, the poor immigrant kid who rose to power and wealth, who commanded respect and built an empire. The old-timers in the North End remembered when Italians were discriminated against, when they lived in poverty and were treated as second-class citizens. Nick had shown that an Italian could be powerful in Kansas City, but this pride came at a tremendous cost. Nick and other Italian-American gangsters reinforced negative stereotypes about Italians being criminals. For decades, law-abiding Italian-Americans in Kansas City struggled against the assumption that they must have some connection to organized crime. Parents told their children to stay away from the old neighborhoods, to distance themselves from the culture that had produced Nick Civella. Younger generations of Italian Americans, college-educated professionals who'd moved to the suburbs, often expressed frustration with how the Civella name had come to define Italian Kansas City. They'd worked hard to build legitimate careers, to be good citizens, to contribute positively to their community, and yet, the shadow of organized crime persisted for law enforcement. Nick's career represented both failure and eventual success. The FBI and local police had spent decades trying to bring him down, often frustrated by corruption and lack of legal tools. His eventual conviction in 1979 was a major victory, proof that even the most powerful mob boss wasn't above the law. But it had taken far too long, and he'd been allowed to operate freely for most of his career. The lessons learned from the Civella case influenced law enforcement strategy nationwide. The RICO statute that helped bring Nick down became the standard tool for prosecuting organized crime. The investigative techniques developed during the case, sophisticated wiretaps, financial analysis, turning informants, became standard practice. In a sense, taking down Nick Civella helped federal authorities figure out how to dismantle other crime families across the country. But there's also a lesson in how Nick managed to operate so successfully for so long. He understood that corruption was a system, not just individual acts. He didn't just bribe one cop or one politician. He cultivated relationships at every level, created networks of complicity, and built a structure where everyone had an incentive to keep quiet. This systematic approach to corruption was both his greatest strength and ultimately part of his downfall. As the system became too large and too visible to maintain indefinitely in the broader history of American organized crime, Nick Civella occupies an interesting position. He wasn't as famous as Al Capone or as romanticized as Lucky Luciano. Kansas City wasn't New York or Chicago. But Nick represented something important: the spread of sophisticated organized crime beyond the major coastal and industrial cities. He showed that even a mid-sized, Midwestern city could support a significant criminal empire. His connection to Las Vegas is particularly significant historically. The mob's involvement in Las Vegas casinos represented organized crime's greatest success at infiltrating and profiting from a legal industry. The skimming operation that Nick helped run represented hundreds of millions of dollars stolen over decades. When federal authorities finally shut down the skim in the late 1970s, it marked a turning point in Las Vegas history, the end of mob dominance and the beginning of corporate control. The human cost of Nick Civella's career is difficult to calculate, but certainly significant. There were the direct victims, people killed on his orders or by his organization. While exact numbers are unknown, estimates suggest dozens of murders attributable to the Kansas City mob during his reign. Each of those deaths represented a life ended, a family destroyed, and often unsolved cases that denied closure to loved ones. Asterisk. Then there were the indirect victims, the gamblers who lost everything at his casinos and betting operations, the borrowers crushed by usurious loan shark rates, the business owners forced to pay protection money, the workers whose unions were corrupted for mob benefit. These people didn't die, but their lives were damaged or destroyed by Nick's organization, and there were the societal costs, the corruption that undermined good government, the violence that created fear, the cynicism that eroded civic trust. Kansas City paid a price for Nick, Civella's empire that can't be calculated in dollars or body counts. Yet it's also worth asking, what created Nick Civella? He didn't emerge from nowhere. He was a product of specific historical and social conditions: immigration, poverty, discrimination, prohibition, and corruption that existed before he was born. The North End that raised him was a place where crime was often the most realistic path to prosperity, where respect came from power rather than virtue, where the official system seemed designed to keep immigrants poor and marginalized. This doesn't excuse his choices. Nick made deliberate decisions to become a criminal, to hurt people, to corrupt institutions. But understanding the context helps explain how someone could make those choices and how others could support or enable him. If we want to prevent future Nick Civellas, we need to address the conditions that create them: poverty, lack of legitimate opportunity, systemic corruption, and communities where crime is normalized. In popular culture, Nick Civella has been largely forgotten. Unlike gangsters from larger cities who've been endlessly depicted in movies and television, there have been a few books about Kansas City's mob history, some documentary segments, occasional references in organized crime histories. But he never achieved the fame or infamy of more celebrated mobsters. This is partly because his career coincided with less media attention to organized crime, partly because Kansas City wasn't a media center, and partly because Nick himself avoided the spotlight. Unlike some gangsters who courted publicity, Nick understood that obscurity was protective. He never wanted to be famous. He wanted to be powerful. But there's also something emblematic in his relative obscurity. Nick Civella was, in many ways, representative of countless mid-level mobsters across America, powerful in their own domains, but not nationally significant figures. For every Capone or Gotti, there were dozens of Nick Civellas, running smaller operations in smaller cities, exercising power that was very real to those affected by it, but invisible to the broader public. As we move further from the era when Nick operated, the mid-20th century world of traditional organized crime, political machines, and open corruption, his story becomes more historical than contemporary. The Kansas City he ruled is largely gone. The North End has been redeveloped, the old downtown entertainment districts demolished, the political culture transformed, but the fundamental lessons of his life remain relevant. The lesson that power without accountability corrupts, that criminal organizations can flourish when law enforcement and political systems are compromised, that economic desperation and lack of opportunity create environments where crime becomes attractive, that loyalty and fear can build empires, but those empires are ultimately unstable, that no matter how powerful someone becomes, they're still mortal, still vulnerable, still eventually accountable. Nick Civella died knowing he had failed. Not failed to achieve power. He'd had more of that than most people ever dream of, but failed to make it last, to protect the organization he'd built, to avoid the consequences of his choices. In his last months, as cancer and imprisonment destroyed his body and federal prosecutors dismantled his organization, he must have confronted the reality that his life's work was collapsing. There's something almost Shakespearean about Nick's arc, the rise from nothing to everything, the years of seeming invincibility, and then the fall, not sudden, but gradual and complete, with enough time to see and understand what was happening. He lived long enough to experience defeat, which is perhaps worse than dying at the height of power. Kansas City today bears little obvious trace of Nick Civella's reign. The Villa Capri is gone. The neighborhoods he controlled have changed beyond recognition. The political culture, while not perfect, is far less openly corrupt. Most young people in Kansas City have never heard his name, and if they have, it's as historical trivia rather than living memory. But dig a little deeper, and his influence persists in subtle ways. The patterns of corruption he established occasionally resurface. The organized crime connections he helped build between Kansas City and other cities remain relevant to modern law enforcement. The families affected by his organization's violence still carry those scars. The Italian-American community still sometimes confronts stereotypes his career reinforced. History is not just about what happened, but about what it means and what it teaches. Nick Civella's story teaches us about the American dream's shadow side, the way that ambition, intelligence, and determination can be channeled toward destruction rather than creation. It teaches us about the fragility of institutions and the importance of integrity in public service. It teaches us about loyalty and betrayal, power and vulnerability, rise and fall. Perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that crime does not pay, not in the simple moralistic sense that criminals always get caught, because many don't, but in the deeper sense that power built on violence and corruption is ultimately empty. Nick Civella died in his 70s, wealthy in theory but actually broken, his empire destroyed, his legacy tainted. He achieved everything he thought he wanted and lost it all. Was it worth it? Only Nick could answer that, and he took that answer to his grave in 1983. But for those of us studying his life decades later, the answer seems clear. No amount of power or wealth justifies the human cost of his career. The families destroyed, the institutions corrupted, the violence inflicted. These consequences far outweigh whatever empire he built. Nick Civella was many things: intelligent, ambitious, ruthless, strategic, and ultimately tragic. He was a product of his time and environment, but also a man who made choices. He hurt many people, corrupted institutions, and left Kansas City worse than he found it. His story is worth telling, not to glorify him, but to understand him and to remember why the path he chose leads only to destruction. In the end, the king of Kansas City died a prisoner of his own choices. His empire already ruins, his power already dust. It's a fitting conclusion to a life lived in the shadows, a reminder that no matter how high someone rises through crime and corruption, the fall is inevitable. The empire of Nick Civella is gone. Only the lessons remain. Asterisk, when an empire falls, it leaves behind more than just memories and legends. It leaves a vacuum, a question hanging in the air. What comes next? In the years following Nick Civella's death in 1983, Kansas City faced this question directly. The city that had been shaped by organized crime for decades had to reinvent itself, to heal from the corruption that had infected its institutions, and to move forward into an uncertain future. This is the story of what happened after the king died, the battles for succession, the transformation of a city, and the long shadow that Nick Civella's reign continued to cast over Kansas City long after he was gone. The immediate aftermath of Nick Civella's death in March. 1983 created chaos in Kansas City's underworld. For more than 40 years, Nick had been the central authority, the ultimate decision-maker, the man who kept the various criminal factions in line. With him gone, that authority disappeared overnight, and what remained of his organization faced an existential crisis. Who would take over, and could they maintain control? Nick's brother, Carl "Karki" Civella, was the logical successor. He'd been Underboss for years, had helped run operations during Nick's imprisonment, and carried the family name. But Karki was not Nick. He lacked his brother's strategic brilliance, his ability to navigate complex political relationships, and most crucially, his authority. The old-timers who had feared and respected Nick didn't necessarily transfer that same deference to Karki. More problematically, Karki was also facing federal heat. The investigations that had brought down Nick hadn't stopped with his conviction. The FBI had continued building cases, developing informants, and gathering evidence about the organization's operations. Karki knew that indictments were likely coming, that his time as boss might be measured in months rather than years. He attempted to hold things together. In the months after Nick's death, Karki met with the remaining capos, trying to present a unified front. He reached out to Chicago, seeking reassurance that the outfit would continue to recognize Kansas City's autonomy under his leadership. He tried to restart some of the gambling operations that had been shut down, to show that the organization could still generate income, but it was a losing battle. The Kansas City that Nick had ruled was gone. The political protection that had been so crucial to the organization's success had evaporated. The new police chief, appointed in the early 1980s as part of a reform movement, was committed to actually enforcing the law. Without protection, gambling establishments were raided within days of opening. Loan sharks were arrested. The machinery of corruption that had sustained Nick's empire for decades had stopped functioning. The money dried up. The Las Vegas skim, which had generated millions annually, was completely dead. Federal oversight of the casinos made it impossible. The street-level rackets that remained were small-time operations that barely generated enough to support the soldiers running them, let alone provide tribute up the chain. Associates who had grown wealthy during Nick's reign found themselves struggling to pay basic expenses. Worst of all, the code of silence that had protected the organization was completely shattered. Throughout 1983 and 1984, more associates became informants, seeing no future in an organization that was clearly dying. These informants provided evidence that led to new indictments, which created more pressure for others to cooperate. It was a death spiral. Each new informant made the organization weaker, which made more people willing to inform. In 1984, just over a year after Nick's death, the inevitable happened. Karki Civella and several other high-ranking members of the organization were indicted on multiple federal charges. The indictment read like a history of Kansas City organized crime, detailing decades of racketeering, conspiracy, and corruption. Federal prosecutors were seeking to completely dismantle what remained of the Civella organization. Karki's trial in 1985 was far less dramatic than Nick's had been. The outcome was never really in doubt. The evidence was overwhelming, and several former associates testified against him. In December 1985, Karki was convicted and sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. He was 63 years old. Unlike his brother, who had at least been released before dying, Karki would spend the rest of his life behind bars. He died in federal prison in 1994, never having experienced freedom after his conviction. With both Civella brothers gone, Nick dead, Corky imprisoned for life, the Kansas City mob as an organized entity effectively ceased to exist. There were still individual criminals, still small-time operations, still people with connections to the old organization. But the hierarchical structure, the systematic corruption, the empire that Nick had built, all of it was gone. Other cities with stronger mob traditions, like New York or Chicago, managed to survive the loss of individual bosses. New leadership emerged, organizations adapted, and while weakened by federal prosecutions, they continued operating. But Kansas City had always been different. Its organized crime operation had been so centered on Nick Civella personally that when he fell, the entire structure collapsed. This complete dismantling represented a major victory for federal law enforcement. The strategies that had worked against the Civella organization, RICO prosecutions, sophisticated surveillance, turning informants, became the blueprint for taking down mob families nationwide. In cities across America throughout the 1980s and 1990s, federal prosecutors used the Kansas City case as a model for their own organized crime prosecutions. But while law enforcement celebrated, Kansas City faced the difficult work of recovery. The corruption that Nick had fostered hadn't disappeared overnight. Even with the mob gone, there were still cops who'd taken payoffs for years, politicians who'd worked with criminals, systems and relationships that had been compromised. The city underwent significant reforms in the mid to late 1980s. Police department policies were overhauled, with new internal affairs procedures designed to catch corruption early. Civilian oversight boards were established to provide independent review of police conduct. The political culture began to change as well, with reform candidates winning elections and implementing transparency measures. The North End, the neighborhood where Nick had grown up and which had been the heart of his operation, underwent dramatic physical transformation. Urban renewal projects that had begun in the 1970s accelerated in the 1980s. Old tenements were demolished. Streets were rebuilt. The tight-knit Italian enclave that had produced Nick Civella was dispersed, its residents moving to suburbs or other neighborhoods. Some longtime residents mourned the loss of community, even while acknowledging its darker aspects. The North End, for all its poverty and crime, had been a place where people knew each other, where immigrant families supported one another, where there was genuine community feeling. The new development that replaced it was cleaner, safer, and more prosperous, but also more anonymous, lacking the distinctive character of the old neighborhood. The Italian-American community in Kansas City also underwent transformation in the decades after Nick's death. The younger generations, educated and increasingly assimilated into mainstream American culture, worked to distance themselves from organized crime associations. Italian cultural organizations emphasized legitimate heritage, the food, the language, the traditions, while explicitly rejecting any connection to the mob. This wasn't always easy. For years, whenever Kansas City's Italian community was mentioned in media, there would inevitably be references to the Civella mob. Italian restaurants had to carefully manage their image to avoid any suggestion of mob connections. Italian-American professionals sometimes faced questions about whether they had ties to organized crime, forced to explicitly deny connections to something that had happened before many of them were even born. But gradually, time and distance helped. By the 2000s, A new generation of Kansas City residents had grown up who had no direct memory of Nick Civella or his organization. The mob era became history rather than current events, something studied in books rather than experienced firsthand. The broader transformation of Kansas City in the post-Civella era was dramatic. The city that had once been known for its wide-open vice and political corruption reinvented itself. Economic development focused on legitimate businesses, telecommunications, healthcare, finance. The downtown that had once been filled with mob-connected clubs and casinos was redeveloped into a modern business district, Kansas City's Power and Light District, a major entertainment and retail development that opened in 2008, occupied some of the same geography where Nick's operations had once run, but where those operations had been illicit gambling dens and mob-controlled clubs. The new district featured chain restaurants, corporate retail, and carefully managed nightlife. It was sanitized, legal, and profitable. Everything Nick's empire had pretended to be, but never was. The physical traces of Nick's empire are largely gone from Kansas City today. The Villa Capri restaurant, his headquarters, was torn down decades ago. The buildings where gambling operations ran have been demolished or repurposed. The homes where mob meetings occurred are now occupied by people who have no idea of the history. Kansas City has quite literally built over its organized crime past, but some reminders remain. The River Key District, once a thriving entertainment area that Nick had controlled, was destroyed by suspicious fires in the 1970s, fires that many believe were connected to organized crime conflicts. The empty lots and underutilized buildings in that area serve as a reminder of the destruction that mob control brought. There are also the human reminders. Families still mourning loved ones killed during the mob wars. Elderly residents who remember when organized crime openly controlled their neighborhoods. Former law enforcement officers who spent their careers fighting the Civella organization. These people carry the memories of what Kansas City was like during Nick's reign. Academic and journalistic interest in Nick Civella and Kansas City's mob history has increased in recent decades. Several books have been written examining the era, using FBI files released under Freedom of Information Act requests and interviews with surviving participants. Documentaries have explored how Kansas City became so thoroughly corrupted and how it eventually recovered. These historical examinations have revealed details that weren't known at the time. The extent of the Las Vegas skim, for instance, turned out to be even larger than originally believed. Estimates suggest the mob skimmed over $280 million from Vegas casinos between the 1950s and late 1970s, with significant portions flowing to Kansas City. The level of political corruption was also more extensive than publicly known, with connections reaching even into state-level politics. The legal legacy of the Civella prosecutions continues to influence American law enforcement. The RICO statute that was so effective against Nick's organization remains the primary tool for prosecuting organized crime. The investigative techniques developed during the Kansas City cases, particularly the use of sophisticated financial analysis and electronic surveillance, are now standard practice, but there are also cautionary lessons from the Civella era that remain relevant. The investigation and prosecution took far too long. Nick operated freely for most of his criminal career, dying before he could serve a significant prison sentence. This delay was partly due to inadequate legal tools, but also due to corruption and lack of will among local law enforcement. Modern law Enforcement agencies have learned from these failures, but the fundamental challenges remain. Organized crime adapts to new conditions. Corruption is an eternal temptation for those in power. And systematic enforcement requires resources and commitment that can be difficult to maintain over time. In the broader context of American organized crime history, the Civella organization's complete collapse after Nick's death is relatively unusual. Most crime families survive the loss of individual bosses, adapted to changing conditions, and continue operating in some form today. The complete dismantling of the Kansas City mob suggests that it was always more fragile than it appeared, more dependent on Nick's personal leadership and relationships than on institutional strength. This raises interesting questions about the nature of criminal organizations. Was Nick's approach highly centralized, dependent on personal relationships and corruption, inherently unsustainable? Would a different structure have been more resilient? Or was Kansas City simply too small and too exposed to maintain a permanent organized crime presence once federal law enforcement made it a priority? The human stories from the aftermath of the Civella era are often tragic. Associates who'd spent decades in the organization found themselves unemployable in legitimate industries, their criminal records and reputations making it impossible to start over. Some ended up in poverty, dependent on family support or government assistance. Others committed suicide, unable to cope with the loss of their former lives. The children and grandchildren of Civella organization members often struggled with their heritage. Some embraced it, romanticizing the mob era and their relatives' roles in it. Others rejected it completely, changing their names and cutting ties with that part of their family history. Many fell somewhere in between, acknowledging the reality while trying to move beyond it. Federal witness protection programs absorbed several dozen former Kansas City mob associates who'd cooperated with prosecutors. These people received new identities and relocation assistance in exchange for their testimony. Most disappeared into ordinary lives in other cities, their mob past known only to their handlers. Occasionally, one would be discovered, leading to brief media attention before they disappeared again. The transformation of Kansas City in the decades since Nick's death has been so complete that it's sometimes hard for younger residents to believe the mob era really happened. The city they know, relatively safe, reasonably well governed, focused on technology and healthcare industries, seems incompatible with stories of systematic corruption and organized crime control, yet the history is real and documented. For approximately 40 years, from the early 1940s to the early 1980s, Kansas City was a mob city. Not as famous as Las Vegas or Chicago, but just as thoroughly controlled by organized crime in many ways. Nick Civella's reign shaped the city's development, influenced its political culture, and left scars that took decades to heal. The lessons from this era remain relevant not just for Kansas City, but for any city facing organized crime and corruption. The first lesson is that these problems don't solve themselves. It took sustained federal intervention to break the Civella organization's control. Local law enforcement and politics had been too thoroughly corrupted to address the problem from within. The second lesson is that recovery is possible, but requires commitment. Kansas City didn't just arrest the mobsters and move on. It reformed its institutions, changed its political culture, and made deliberate choices to be different than it had been. This transformation took years and required leadership willing to make difficult decisions. The third lesson is about the human cost of organized crime. It's easy to romanticize gangsters, to focus on their power and wealth, and overlook the damage they caused. But Nick Civella's empire was built on violence, addiction, bankruptcy, and corruption. Real people suffered, not abstract victims, but families destroyed, businesses ruined, communities damaged. As we move further from the Civella era, as the people who lived through it age and pass away, Kansas City faces a choice about how to remember this history. Some argue for forgetting, for focusing on the city's present and future rather than its criminal past. Others believe the history should be remembered and taught, ensuring that future generations understand what happened and why it must never happen again. The truth is probably somewhere between these extremes. Kansas City doesn't need to be defined by its mob past, but neither should that history be erased or minimized. It happened, it mattered, and it shaped the city in ways that persist even now, decades after Nick Civella's death. Today, Kansas City is a very different place than the one Nick ruled. It's more prosperous, better governed, and far less corrupt. The wide-open vice that once characterized the city is gone. The political machines that made systematic corruption possible have been dismantled. The neighborhoods where organized crime flourished have been transformed beyond recognition, but on quiet streets in older parts of the city. Elderly residents sometimes share memories of the mob era, not always condemning it. Sometimes even nostalgic for aspects of that time. They remember when the North End was a real community, when people looked out for each other, when there was a certain order to things even in the criminal underworld. These memories, however flawed by nostalgia and selective editing, are part of Kansas City's story. They remind us that history is complex, that even dark periods had human dimensions, that people lived real lives in circumstances we now judge from safe historical distance. Nick Civella's grave in Mount St. Mary's Cemetery is a simple affair, no elaborate monument, nothing to suggest the power he once wielded. Occasionally, someone leaves flowers or a small memorial item, though whether from family members or dark tourists is impossible to say. Most days, it's just another headstone in a large cemetery, distinguished only by the name that once meant power and fear in Kansas City. That simple grave is perhaps the most fitting symbol of Nick's legacy. For all his power, for all the fear he inspired and the empire he built, he ended as everyone ends, in the ground, reduced to a name on stone. His empire dust and his power vanished. The city he ruled has moved on, transformed itself, and built something new on the ruins of what he created. Kansas City after Civella is a story of recovery and transformation, of a city that faced its darkest impulses and chose to be better. It's not a perfect city, no city is, but it's one that learned from its past, that made deliberate choices to reject the corruption and violence that once defined it. The king is dead. The empire has crumbled. The city has moved on, but the lessons remain, etched into Kansas City's history. A permanent reminder of what can happen when crime and corruption go unchecked, and what's possible when a community decides to change. That's the complete story of Nick Civella's brutal reign over Kansas City, 6 chapters chronicling his rise from the poverty of the North End to absolute power, and his eventual fall as the empire he built crumbled around him. If this deep dive into one of America's most fascinating but lesser-known mob bosses captivated you, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story from the dark side of history. Drop a comment below telling us which gangster's story you want us to cover next, from the infamous kingpins everyone knows to the shadowy, figures who ruled from the background. And if you made it this far, leave a in the comments to show you're a true fan of these tales from the underworld. Remember, history's darkest chapters teach the most important lessons. Until next time, keep exploring the shadows, because the truth is always more fascinating than the legend.